Okay, well, God bless you, every one of you tonight. It's a pleasure to be here on this August 29th, 2024. And we're going to be going into Genesis 11, as well as we're going to study Mount St. Helens, of all things to study in regard to Genesis, as well as the Ice Age. So what we've done is we've gone through these first 10 plus chapters in Genesis, and we've gone through the creation, the beginning in Adam and Eve, and we've set the basis here for people so we can understand and seeing it from a scientific point of view as well, so we can see how these things really did happen and they do fit with real science. And there's been a lot, one of the problems that we've had with uh, is in order to have evolution to occur, they knew it had to take many, many, many years, millions, and even billions of years for anybody to believe in that particular theory. It is a theory, and they can also say, well, what you're telling us is a theory too, isn't it? Well, yeah. In another way, it's theoretical because I wasn't there to see it, and no scientist was there to see it. Nobody was there to see the Big Bang. Nobody was there to see the creation except for God. And not long after that, a whole bunch of wonderful angels. Some of them didn't turn out so good, but most of them stayed good. So they're witnesses, but God was there and he knew what happened. So we got a leg up on the competition. But one of the things they've done to kind of discredit God is to say that, well, scientists say it's billions of years ago. You mean to tell me you believe that you came from Adam and Eve? Isn't that kind of silly? Uh, and this is the kind of arguments that you get into. The fossil record. Dinosaurs are 68 billion plus or million plus years old. What about that? When I went to school, these little kids, they go to school and they see a little ark, that looks like a rubber boat with, a giraffe's head sticking out of it and an elephant's trunk on one side. Really cute. Kids love it. The ark looked nothing like that. But what happens is then you think, well, it's just a fairy tale. Isn't that sweet? When the ark was like 500 feet long. Well, how can you get all the species in there? I mean, there's what, hundreds of breeds of dogs? How many cats? How many cows? The Bible says kinds. And so it ended up probably around 7,000 animals were on the ark. Plenty of room because from one pair of dogs, they got all these breeds. So when God made animals, he put in all this genetic material or genetic potentiality that it could turn into it. And if you check history, I think all these dog breeds have just been around for a few hundred years. So then you can start to make sense. These people say, well, oh, okay. And then when you look like we've looked at as the reformation of the Earth's surface during the flood, the Grand Canyon, oh, that took millions of years to produce. Well, it took a lot of time and a little bit of water, or it took a whole lot of water and a little bit of time. So I'm going to show you tonight how a Grand Canyon can be formed in hours. Now, the Grand Canyon of today, maybe it took a little bit longer in a few hours, but it did not take millions of years. And I'll give you some proof of that. So I'm giving you things that will be helpful as you talk to other people, your kids, your grandkids, your great grandkids, your friends and people when they ask questions about this. I had a discussion with my daughter last night, and she's been taught all of her life, but there's certain things she had questions about, and so I was able to help her understand, give her some answers. And the Bible tells us that we are supposed to, as I alluded to earlier, that we're supposed to have a reason to give to every man of the hope that lives within us. That's kind of paraphrased. So when we have questions, we want to be able to answer them. If we can't answer them, at least we can direct them to somebody or something or some video that can, because The whole thing in life is we got a choice. Are we going to live everlastingly or are we going to die everlastingly? That's the big deal. And that is a huge deal. Everybody's got to choose. Now, we've chosen, we believe God, we trust God. And we know that by confessing Jesus as Lord and believing in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we're saved. And we've got that seal, we've got that guarantee, and we're going to be in the age to come. But not everybody will. And we need to tell them and we need to help them the best we can that so they can understand that the Bible is truthful, God's true, and you can believe it. So tonight we're going to start out in Genesis 11, and we're going to do a wrap up here because we got into it fairly thoroughly last week on the Tower of Babel, which is a very interesting record. Matter of fact, I think there's a company now that's called Babel or Babel. I guess you can pronounce it either way. And it's all the different languages. And as you know, there's a ton of them. And so helping, and then there's Rosetta Stone, I think is another one. And so maybe one of these days we'll get to learn how to speak Urdu or these other African languages that are so important. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now, I think. There. So last week we studied Genesis 10, which gave us the history of the descendants of Noah and his three sons. And we also talked about how the Bible is not always in chronological order. Let me go back here. I'm in the commentary. And by the way, I am reading from the Revised English Version, and I do use the REV commentary and other sources to help me put these teachings together. I've used information by Michael Orr, another Dr. Stephen Austin, and Georgia Purdon, organizations like Answers in Genesis, and other organizations that are helpful. So I like to give credit where credit is due. And I'm very thankful for these people that have been so helpful in presenting this. And there is just such a tremendous amount of information to be found these days. And I'll give you some of those resources. Okay, so Genesis 10 actually sums up what happens, and Genesis 11 tells us how it happened. And it's not in chronological order, and that's not unusual. There's several places in the books of the Bible, and I won't take the time right now, where things are not always in chronological order. You can look in Revelation, and it's not always in chronological order. And to get the end times information, you're going to have to go through a lot of other books in the Bible to get the whole picture of what's going to happen in the future. Daniel and Isaiah, Jeremiah, lots of places where it was prophesied. So here we are at the Tower of Babel. And now we're going to go into more detail of what we looked at last week. And I'm just going to back up here just for a second. So you could see in 10 where it started out the table of nations and how these are the descendants of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We know Japheth was the oldest. Ham was the youngest. Shem is listed first, probably because of the honor of being in the cross line. And then we see their sons and the sons of their sons, and so on and so on. And we learned about Ham and Canaan, and Cush fathered Nimrod, and he was a really evil guy that was very much involved in starting that first the great tower, the Tower of Babel, which we actually saw the remains by a satellite imagery that it's in Babylon. And they have what they think might be the remains of that Tower of Babel. And so this is a real deal. This is not just a fairy tale. It's a big deal. And so we have all the sons. It's not a fairy tale. I'm sorry, I can hear my little granddaughter in the background. I don't know if you can hear her, but she's right around the corner. Um, so we went through all those details, and it ended up with these are the clans of the sons of Noah according to the generations in their nations. From these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So now we're going to get into the more details. And the whole earth here in 1:1, the whole earth had one language. Now that's before the Tower of Babel, which we already read about in the last chapter. Had one language. And sometimes it could be called one tongue, or even one lip, but it means language in one set of words. So if you have just one language, you're going to have one set of words. Now we don't, we're not sure. I've heard people talk about it. Some will say it had to be Hebrew. Others said it's Aramaic, and others have said maybe it's not quite the same. We don't know, but it was one set of words, like English. We have the English language, and that's one set of words. How many words we don't know. But since there's only one language, there's one set of words. And as they traveled east, okay, so we know about where the ark was. We learned that was there in very, very far eastern Turkey, uh, and in the mountains of Ararat. A lot of people like to say it was on the mountain of Ararat, of which there are two, one taller and one shorter, but that makes not a whole lot of sense. These are steep mountains. And for the ark to be on top of a very steep volcanic mountain, which probably didn't grow until about the end of the flood anyhow, it seems highly unlikely that it was on that mountain. But in the mountains, as the Bible says, in the mountains, plural, the Mount of Ararat. So there's an area over there that's more conducive if a ark landed on it. It'd be lower in elevation, not real high, and it's not surrounded by a lot of cliffs where the elephants would roll down the hill and go extinct. So it was not that kind of place. So they traveled east from this area after Noah and the three sons and their wives got out. So some of them traveled east. Now, we're not saying they got off the ark and headed east right away, because we think there's probably 2 or 3 generations, maybe even 4, because we remembered last week we talked about there was one person and it talked about the earth being divided, and is thinking that maybe that's when the tower first came up. And I think that's about 4 generations down from Noah. So there's time for people to grow and expand. And people say, well, who'd they marry? They married their sisters. And we've talked about that. That sounds kind of weird to us in this day and time. But I tell you, back in the time of Adam and Eve, it was no big deal. They were genetically pure, and that's who they married. And sometimes they'd marry nieces, whatever, close. Even in this country today, you can marry up to as close as second cousin, I believe. And the reason why it's been stopped, and then God put a stop to it later on, because as time went by, the genetics became weaker and started to mutate. And so you start seeing these recessive things showing up in people. And then you see birth defects and different other problems when you get people that are married too close. If you have diversity and distance, most likely the dominant genes will blend. So they traveled east, and how many they doesn't mean the whole group did, but some of them went, and they went to the plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. Now Shinar, as we know today, is Iraq, and back then the area was in the Babylonian area, because we know that Babylon was right north of the Tower of Babel. So we got that area. So we're pretty sure where that should be. And they said one to another, come, let us make bricks and burn them with fire. Well, you normally don't burn bricks with fire unless you're in a big hurry. Normally you set them out in the sun and let them dry. So these guys were in a hurry, and they had brick. They had brick for stone, and they had bitumen for mortar. And a few weeks ago, we talked about this bitumen. There is a resin that's called, from tree sap, that can be made into bitumen. And apparently there's some other natural forming types of bitumen that you can find in the earth. Now, we don't want to get confused with modern day asphalt or modern day tar, because those require refinement. And they had to be refined to produce that. And of course, they weren't doing that then. And 2, we also know that coal and crude oil are the results of the pressure caused by the flood on matter. And this matter made plant matter turned into coal when it was compressed hard enough. And oil actually is from compressed dinosaur remains. You can check this out. That's why they call it fossil fuels, which people are so concerned about. If you look at coal really closely, you can see tree bark in it. Now, oil is a different story. But anyhow, this bitumen is not tar or asphalt. It is a natural forming thing that had nothing to do because way back then it wasn't available. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. So they wanted to build this big city and they wanted to build this tower. Well, what had God just told them to do? The command to them after they got off the ark, let me see if I can find it real quickly here. I didn't write this in my notes, but uh, not long after, here it is in Genesis 9. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, these guys are saying, well, maybe we don't want to go fill the earth. And then again, he set it down again in verse 7, be fruitful and multiply, increase abundantly on the earth and multiply on it. And that was the request by God. It sounds very similar to the one that he gave Adam and Eve. And so these guys kind of just said, no, we're going to build a city, we're going to build a tower, it's going to be a high tower, and we're going to make ourselves a name. We're going to be a big deal. Sounds like a little ego and pride in there. Lest we come spread out all over the face of the earth. They did not want to spread out. So this is an act of rebellion. God said to do it. They said no. And Yahweh came down. Even if they built a really tall tower, they still don't get up high enough. God still has to come down. Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower that the children of men had built. And Yahweh said, behold. Now, who's he talking to? Well, remember the guys back in Genesis 1:1, let us make man in our image. And now you can do some studies on this is God's divine counsel. We're not quite sure how many are on it. In the book of Revelation, it looks like there might be 12, but these are spirit beings that God created, and he put them in positions of authority and as advisors, and they had quite a bit to do with the earth. Now, we've gone through this. You know this, that God could do everything if he wanted to, but where's the intimacy in that? He wanted to be intimate with his creation and he delegated authority. Adam and Eve were given dominion over the earth. In the age to come, we'll be given kingdoms to reign upon, to reign over and to help. God likes to diversify and give authority to those people that he wants to do that to. And so he said, they are one people and they have one language. See, they all can speak to each other. They both all know what everybody's thinking or talking about anyhow. And this is what they are beginning to do. Now, now all the things that they intend to do will not be withheld from them. They can pretty much just stay there and do whatever they want and become apparently as proud and evil as they want. So he said, come, let's go down. Let us, who's that? Again, that's the divine council. Go down there and confuse. This is the word Babel. That means confuse their language so they do not understand each other's language. So Yahweh spread them out from all over the face of the whole of the earth. So God's going to get them to spread out because what happened is they stopped building a city because they had confusion. So they couldn't say, hey, you need to put this mortar over here. You build these bricks. People are saying, I don't understand what you're talking about. So you got this massive confusion. They could not coordinate their work groups. And so they decided what ended up happening is those people who spoke the same languages kind of stuck together and off they went to do their own thing. And this is where they spread out. And we studied that last week with where did these descendants go? And we have a pretty good idea. Therefore, it was called Babel because Yahweh confused the language of all the earth. And from there, Yahweh spread them out all over the face of the whole earth. And as we know, history shows That's exactly what happened. The earth is now populated all over the place. We've got people all over. They're not just there in the Middle East where the ark was and Noah's, they're all over the place. So they did end up going, and now we've got all these languages, and a lot of languages have developed since the Tower of Babel. Not every language that you hear spoken today, oh, they spoke that at Babel. No, not necessarily. We don't know how many languages were uh, developed there, but all these other languages have come into existence as people started to develop them. So that's where they went. So that wraps up the Tower of Babel and the study there, those two chapters. And so we're going to move on to something else. And before we get too far away from the flood, as we move into other parts of Genesis, there's some things that I thought would be important to put in your quiver of information about what happened. So I'm going to share with you tonight what we've learned from the geology caused by Mount St. Helens. And the eruption of Mount St. Helens back in 1980, and a lot of us, we knew that. And of course, you guys out west were very aware of it. Even us that lived in Ohio had dust on our cars. I remember when I lived in Ohio back in 1980, and some of you went out east and other places. So Mount St. Helens was a big deal. And it wasn't just a big deal in 1980, it became a big deal in 81 and 82. It kept things from going on. And so there's massive geological changes around this fairly not a huge volcano, but we learned something. And this is what we're going to see. I'm going to allow this man, Dr. Steve Austin, has done quite a bit of work on the study of this. And so I'm going to play, I've got a couple of segments here. They're each about 10 or 15 minutes long, I think. And I'm going to let him share this and we'll have time to talk about it here in a little bit. So let me get this put up here. So get started. And this is called, okay. I'm not playing the whole thing, but I'm going to give you the information. I'm going to play excerpts or what I thought's most appropriate, and then you can listen to the whole things when I send you links if you so desire. So let me come back and I'm going to share my screen. I'll start the video.
We're here on the north flank of Mount St. Helens in the basin called the North Fork of the Toutle River. This is the site of the enormous debris avalanche deposit. This deposit is sitting over about 25 square miles, and it makes this enormous area that's Earth's newest landscape. Before the eruption, this was sky. Now it is landscape. And so everything we see here is formed since 1980. What is interesting is that canyon up there called Lewitt Canyon on the left. Lewitt Canyon on the left is eroded over 100 feet deep through solid rock. There's a 500-year-old lava flow that's been gouged out by the force of mud after the summer of 1980. The right canyon over there is even deeper. It's called Step Canyon, and it's eroded over 600 feet deep through lava flows and volcanic ash deposits. All of that erosion occurred rapidly after the summer of 1980. Now we're down here in the landslide deposit. This whole landscape here has been radically altered by the forces of erosion. Here we see this giant terrain which had originally a pit, a low area here, and then on the downstream side there was a debris dam of landslide deposit across that valley. This whole valley was filled with mud up to a level of about 125 feet across the valley. Then the mud overtopped this debris dam and cut down and made a whole series of canyons. We're on the North Fork of the Toutle River, upstream in the landslide debris deposit area where the canyon has been cut through. You see this deep canyon over 140 feet deep, eroded through the deposits since 1980. It might appear that this river eroded this canyon one sand grain at a time over maybe thousands of years, but it didn't happen that way at all. We know from the historic reports and the photographic documentation that this canyon was breached in a single day by the mud flow of March 19th, 1982. There was a giant debris dam here where mud spilled up against it, overtopped the dam, and the downroding mud made this canyon. The stream is caught in this canyon. The stream does not cause the canyon causes the stream. We're looking here at some really remarkable erosion, and all over the terrain and the landscape north of the crater at Mount St. Helens, we see these kind of features. Rapidly formed canyons, having the appearance of maybe thousands and thousands of years, but we know that they formed rapidly. In 1983, we called this the Little Grand Canyon of the North Fork of the Toutle River. And it's a 1/40th scale model of Grand Canyon. Of course, it didn't take millions of years to form this canyon. This was formed in a day by the power of mud that breached that giant debris dam and cut back through this pit. So this terrain is not slowly evolving, it has been formed rapidly by catastrophic process. Most people have heard the theory that the Colorado River has been flowing through the canyon, eroding it very slowly over the period of tens of millions of years. That theory has been popular, but most geologists now have junked that theory and are going to a different theory to explain the origin of Grand Canyon. There are many, many theories out there for how Grand Canyon was eroded, but most geologists are dissatisfied with the idea of the millions of years river. Geologists are speculating that Grand Canyon formed rapidly. There are various ways that it may have formed. The one I like is the idea that there was a great lake of water upstream from the Grand Canyon in the Hopi Desert area, and this lake drained through the plateau in northern Arizona. It breached a dam and drained through the area of the Grand Canyon, 270 miles long, an enormous spillway and drainage of lakes to the east and to the north. Grand Canyon may be explained by catastrophic process, and Mount St. Helens, with the breached dam and the mud flow that occurred, might be a good example. Grand Canyon could be a gigantic breached dam formed by rapid drainage of water from lakes. And it's illustrated by the landscape here at Mount St. Helens. We see at Mount St. Helens the landslide debris that was blocking the valley and the mud that overtopped and breached a dam, creating a spillway with a whole new series of canyons, even a miniature Grand Canyon. So Mount St. Helens provides a model for how Grand Canyon was eroded. On May 18, 1980, when the volcano exploded, there was this gigantic landslide, the largest landslide in recorded history. This lake was displaced by the landslide. As the landslide barreled into the Spirit Lake here, it propelled the water of the lake up to 860 feet above the pre-eruption level. The landslide debris deposited an average of about 200 feet of rock material on the bottom of the lake, and the lake was up high. As the water spilled back into the basin from the gigantic water wave, it brought in all these logs. The day after May 18th, 1 million logs floated on Spirit Lake, and geologists had the opportunity here to study how logs would float over the years as the lake was recovering from the eruption. These logs that float upright in Spirit Lake are amazing. I had to study these logs One way we could study the logs is by sonar survey. And we brought a sonar device into the lake. In a boat, we brought automobile batteries, a sonar recorder, and we towed the sonar towfish under the boat and did the sonar survey of the lake. We found hundreds of upright objects standing on the bottom of the lake. They cast their sonar shadows over the bottom. And you can see the bottom of the lake about 50 feet below the towfish, and you see the image looking out over the side of the boat about 50 yards. And we see 3 upright floating and deposited logs on the bottom of the lake, thin pencil-like reflectors that's standing up off the bottom. This one image here shows what appears to be an immense sonar reflector standing off the bottom of the lake, casting an immense shadow. It even seems to look like a base of a trunk of a tree without flaring root mass. As we did the sonar survey of the bottom of Spirit Lake, we discovered hundreds of upright objects over the small area that we studied, and we estimate that something like 10,000 logs were standing upright on the bottom of Spirit Lake. We had to go diving in Spirit Lake to see what the bottom of the lake was like. We went with
Okay, so I'm going to show another video that's going to be a little bit more concise. He's talking about the logs here, and actually you will see them in that how they fossilize looking like they are standing up. But I've got another video that'll be a little more concise talking about the logs. But I think one of the things we could see is how there's quite a bit of similarity between the Grand Canyon and these valleys that were cut out. And I want to show you some pictures here that I think are very interesting. Let me share my screen. Of course, some of them are very familiar to you probably because they are pictures of the Grand Canyon, which I'm sure you've seen. Some of you have probably been there. Uh, this is the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and you can see the layers of stratification, these laminates. And what we're thinking has occurred was that during the flood of Noah, this would have been all covered with water, of course. And as the tsunami waves and all the different eruptions from the great deep, there would be different layers of silt laid down on the bottom of the ocean. And then as the mountains rose, as we read in Psalms, the mountains rose, and that's why we can actually find fossils on mountains that are over 1,000 feet above sea level. So how do you find fossils of marine life that are on mountaintops 1,000 feet above the current sea level? Well, that means that those mountains at one time were under sea level. And what happened is we know the mountains rose and we know the valley sunk. And when people say, where'd the water from the great flood go? Well, it went into the new landscaped oceans. The oceans now, we have areas that are 5 miles deep and deeper. And there's evidence to show they were never that deep in the original heavens and earth, but this happened after the flood. Mountains rose, and as the water ran off, it did erosion. It made channelization, planations. You'll remember the video that I showed you not too long ago, where it actually reformed the surface of the earth. Now, here in the Grand Canyon, we have the possibility, as Dr. Austin said, a breach in a natural dam. There would have been a stone dam that eventually broke from the receding as the waters were receding off of the surface of the earth, and then that washed out the Grand Canyon in a relatively short period of time. Another piece of evidence here, and in Jim and I were talking about this earlier, in these sedimentary layers, you normally think of when layers are laid down on the bottom of the ocean floor, that they're going to be flat, right? Why? But we're seeing these folds. And then here we have folds. It kind of dips down, it dips up, and then over here it goes straight up. And let me show you this other one down here. Um, you see these folds. Well, how do you get these folds like this? Because normally, if you're talking about millions of years, this rock would become brittle. You know, rocks don't bend. If you try to bend a rock, guess what happens? It breaks. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there was quite a bit of tectonic movement, continental shifting, volcanism. We had, the pressures coming inside the earth were pushing upward. And so how can this happen? It's because the layers were still soft. That's the explanation. You can see these wonderful folds in here because the layers were still soft. I think I've got another picture. Uh, they were soft, and so they're pliable. And so this would have happened, during the ending of the flood, sometimes after the flood is probably when the waters were washing away. It's unknown for sure, but this was soft. This indicates soft layers. So another reason to believe that this isn't millions of years. And where's the erosion? If all these layers represent millions of years, where's the erosion? They're flat layers. They're not eroded away. So another good evidence there that the flood and those different layers there were soft at the time that those were folded. And so I think that's an interesting thing. Now let me show you. I'm going to show you one other excerpts here. There's Dr. Austin is not the only guy talking about this. I'm going to show you a brief. This one's fairly short, but this will be from Answers in Genesis. And Answers in Genesis. Pull this up. I'll get this up here. I don't want it to start yet, but they're going to do a brief recap of what you have seen. And, but I think they're going to add just a little bit more to it. And so I'm going to start this here. This is from Answers in Genesis, and this is Dr. Georgia Purdon. She's got her degrees in, I'm not sure exactly. I don't remember right now, but I'll let her do the talking here. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll see a little bit of this I think will be helpful.
A huge amount of water coming down.
Following the flood.
And we are standing on glacial outwash terrace.
Excuse me. I've got two videos going at the same time, and that's not a good idea. So this one is, okay. Hang on just a second. Just bear with me a minute. Okay, this is not the one. This is the one. Hang on. Stevens. Keep going here just a second. Okay, I need to re-queue this up because it started, and when I come back to it, I want to make sure the right thing's playing. I think we're good here. Started now, I think. Okay, and I'm going to share.
It provides a better clue to what happened in those times than the slow geologic processes which are most commonly seen in the present.
Okay, so what this showed was that under catastrophic conditions, you can get a lot of change in a short period of time. They showed these rock layers that were here. You see the person at the bottom for an idea of how many rock layers are there. Those rock layers were formed in a matter of hours. It did not take millions of years. All it took was the right conditions. They talked a little bit about this canyon. This is called Engineers Canyon. It's 1/40th the scale of the Grand Canyon. It was cut out in 9 hours. That's all it took. right? It just took a catastrophe. Now, there's a little river that runs through that canyon. And I'm going to tell you right now, that river didn't make that canyon, right? Because we know, we observed it in the present. It just took 9 hours to carve that out. Now, I would say the same is true for the Grand Canyon when you go there. Now, when you go there, they'll tell you the Colorado River carved that out over millions of years. Nope, it did not. There's no way. It would not look like that. It looks a lot like it happened very, very quickly, not that long ago. One of the evidences of that is the fact that the faces of the canyon are very steep, okay, and they don't look like they've been weathered away for millions of years, right? They're much more recent because they're the result of probably a post-flood catastrophe that carved that out in probably just a very short period of time as well. Now, let's go on and talk about the fossils. And one of my favorite
Okay, so we're going to talk about the fossils. I'm hoping to do that next week. But she had, I just wanted you to hear that it's not just one or two people saying these things. There's a lot of people that are saying this. It's just not one or two. And she's with Ken Ham in Answers in Genesis. And I'll send you I'll give you the opportunity for the link for that one. And so you can take a closer look. So I'm going to get set up in the background here. I have one last one that I want to share with you. And one thing that, is very curious, that's difficult, people don't understand, is the Ice Age. And the Ice Age is, I think, very interesting. And I'm going to take a few minutes here. And this is going to be Dr. I don't think it's doctor, but it is Michael J. And his last name is Ord. OARD. He used to be with the National Weather Service, and he's done a lot. He has written a book on the formation of the Earth after the flood, and I'm going to show you that here. But he's going to talk about the Ice Age. And the Ice Age is a very interesting thing because scientists have said there's been like 50 or 60 ice ages. Michael Ord is saying there's going to be one ice age, and it occurred right after the flood. Now, you might have questions about the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, some other interesting things. And you'll notice that most of these creatures are not fossilized because they did not die before the flood. These animals died after the flood. So you don't get the fossilization you get from the animals that died before the flood or during the flood. That's where you get all the fossils, because the sediment, and these are in the Grand Canyon. They're in the sediment layers. As I mentioned, they're found on tops of mountains, even though the mountains are way above sea level. So you have all of these fossils, but that was caused by quick and sudden catastrophic event that buried them without oxygen, lots of pressure, and they became fossilized. Now, you probably heard they found woolly mammoths that are whole, and they're still got undigested food in their stomachs. And so these are, you think, oh, these got to be recent. Well, if you want to say right after the flood is recent, I agree with you. But Michael Ord knows he has a lot to say about how the woolly mammoths died. Some of them died standing up. Some of them had broken femurs, and curious, they had undigested food. These were not pre-flood deaths. These were post-flood deaths, and a lot of them occurred because of the Ice Age. So the Ice Age, I'll let Michael Ord share what he wants to share with you, and I think you'll find it interesting. I think this is about a 12-minute segment. He's going to go over the 3 things that are required for an Ice Age: cooler summers, and moist, warm oceans, and these kinds of events happening year after year. So I'll go ahead and get this tuned up. Yeah, I think I'm ready. I think I had to re-cue this. I think I'm in the right spot. If I'm not, I might have to tweak it again. So bear with me, please. I appreciate your patience. I'm going to share this. And here we go.
Is it needs to persist year after year to let the snow and ice build up year after year. So those are the 3 requirements for an ice age. Well, in most areas where the ice occurred, the second ingredient is much
I'm trying to get it queued up to the first one. Here we
Flood
go.
have been the trigger, the climatic trigger for an ice age. Indeed, that is the case. How would that happen? How would the Genesis flood fulfill the three requirements for an ice age? Here we are at the ocean. The oceans play a vital part in the development of an ice age. What are the requirements for an ice age? First, you need much cooler summers. Winters are already cold enough in most areas where the ice occurred. The second ingredient is much more moisture, and that's where the ocean comes in with much heavier evaporation. The third mechanism is it needs to persist year after year to let the snow and ice build up year after year. So those are the three requirements for an ice age. Well, could the Genesis flood have been the trigger, the climatic trigger for an ice age? Indeed, that is the case. How would that happen? How would the Genesis flood fulfill the three requirements for an ice age? First of all, the Genesis flood was a gigantic tectonic and volcanic event. And after the flood, we'd have all this volcanic ash and aerosols trapped in the stratosphere after the flood. And these reflect a lot of sunlight back to space, cooling the surface, especially the continental areas in summer. So there's where you get your summertime cooling, is by all this volcanism. But volcanic ash and aerosols filter out within a matter of months to years. So there needs to be a mechanism to replenish the aerosols. And aerosols are very small particles, about a micron in diameter. You need a mechanism to replenish the aerosols and ash. And indeed you do. During the ice age, the Earth was still not quite in equilibrium from the flood. So you had a little bit of tectonics, a lot of volcanism going off. We have a lot of ash beds and other volcanic material indicating much higher volcanism during the ice age. And this would replenish the volcanic ash and aerosols in the stratosphere and keep the summer cooling continuing. These stratovolcanoes we have in the Cascades, like Mount Hood, is just one of many hundreds of post-flood volcanoes that were going off immediately after the flood for quite a while, probably because the Earth was still out of equilibrium from the flood and was still settling down. To the north of us, we can see three other stratovolcanoes, Mount Adams, Mount Rainier, and then Mount St. Helens with the top blown off. Geological equilibrium means that, the Earth had a huge tectonics, and as a result had a lot of cracks and magma coming up, causing a lot of volcanism. We had a lot of faulting. It took a while to settle down, and everything slow up and the volcanoes lessen, so that we only have just a little bit of volcanism now and only small earth movements going on. In general, we would consider that geological equilibrium at the moment, even though we still have movements of faults and volcanoes going up, but it looks like a lot less than immediately after the flood. Now, we know that volcanoes cause cooling, in fact global cooling for the larger volcanoes, because in historical times we've measured this. For instance, when Mount Tambora went off in 1815, that's the largest eruption in historical time, it caused volcanic ash and aerosols to go around the globe, and it caused a year without a summer, they call it, in 1816 in the northeast United States and also northern Europe. There was crop failures, summer frosts, harvests that failed. We know that volcanoes cause cooling. Other volcanoes cause cooling, like Krakatoa caused cooling, Mount Pinatubo, El Chichon. These were volcanoes that went. These last two are volcanoes that went off in the last 30 years, and these have all caused a little bit of global cooling. Generally about maybe 0.8 of a degree Fahrenheit for up to about 3 years. But these are small volcanoes compared to those immediately after the flood. We have evidence that some were so huge they block out most of the sunlight for a month or two. And these stratovolcanoes that went off at the end of the flood, and mainly early post-flood, were huge. Look at the size of these cones. These represent tremendous volcanism and sending up huge layers of ash and aerosols in the stratosphere. And these are just in the Cascades here, maybe a dozen of them, is just a few of the hundreds across the Earth that were going off early in the Ice Age to replenish that ash and aerosol layer left over from the flood, and all this post-flood volcanism reinforces the ash and aerosols in the stratosphere to continue the cooling for hundreds of years. The second mechanism for an ice age is abundant moisture. Where does that come from? Well, after the end of the flood, the oceans were very warm. Why? Because the Genesis flood was a tectonic volcanic event, and a lot of probably groundwater was added to the pre-flood ocean, so you'd end up with a warm ocean from top to bottom and from pole to pole with no sea ice. Well, the significance of this is that with a warmer ocean, you get much more evaporation into the air. For instance, at an ocean temperature of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you get 7 times the evaporation as you do at water that's 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So with warm oceans at mid and high latitudes, you get tremendous evaporation, and this moisture would get caught up into storms, and the storms would have so much more snowfall that would turn to ice for a rapid ice age. Dr. Larry Vardaman has modeled the effects of a warm ocean in various storm patterns in the eastern Pacific. He's warmed up the temperatures, and he's shown how much precipitation you get in the Sierra Nevadas as well as Yellowstone National Park. And what he discovered is you get something like 4 to 8 to 4 to 10 times as much precipitation with a warm ocean off the coast for the Sierras, which had an ice cap, and also for Yellowstone Park that had an ice cap 3,000 feet deep. Another effect of the warm oceans, besides heavier precipitation, is that they would cause milder winters in the northern hemisphere as well as the southern hemisphere. The way that this works is the warm oceans heat up the air that spread inland, especially in wintertime in storms, and with the Arctic sea ice gone, it all adds up to much warmer winters. They would be below freezing in many areas, but they would be warmer than today. When the evaporation that comes from the ocean condenses, you add all that what's called latent heat to the atmosphere, which also heats up the atmosphere. So the climate in the early ice age, right after the flood, is one of cool summers and mild winters. So you had very little seasonal contrast at the start of the ice age. Another effect of the warm ocean is that it would keep some areas that were glaciated unglaciated until the middle or the end of the ice age. For instance, where you had onshore flow of warm air warmed by the ocean water, the glaciation would delay for a number of years. For instance, along the west coast of the United States, like the Puget Sound area, probably didn't glaciate until midway during the ice age. Same thing in the British Isles, which probably didn't glaciate till midway in the ice age. Also, this onshore flow of warm, moist air would affect the Arctic region, because with no Arctic sea ice and the Arctic Ocean probably starting at a temperature of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you could probably swim in the Arctic Ocean for a while after the flood. This warm water would warm the air and add moisture and cause the lowlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon to be unglaciated. Not glaciated, it was only the mountains of Alaska, Siberia, and the Yukon Territory that were glaciated, which is a major mystery of Earth science. When they run their computer models of glaciation, often some of the first places to glaciate are the lowlands as well as the highlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon Territory. So they're perplexed on why these areas were not glaciated, but yet we can explain it with the post-flood ice age model by warm onshore flow of moist air in the Arctic. This also would cause heavy precipitation. So I would predict that early in the ice age, they probably were forests that grew clear to the Arctic Ocean, and then as it dried off towards the middle ice age period, these forests mostly died off. The third ingredient for an ice age, it has to persist year after year. And indeed, these mechanisms would persist year after year with the replenishment of the volcanic ash and aerosols from post-flood volcanism to evaporation of the oceans. This would continue for quite a while, but as the oceans cooled, your evaporation would become less and less, and so with time you would get less moisture, and therefore there'd come a time the ice would build up to a maximum. I estimated that the oceans would probably be about 86 degrees Fahrenheit on the average after the flood. There'd be cool spots and there'd be warm spots, of course, but an average of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature of the ocean right now is 4 degrees centigrade or 38 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a considerable cooling. But because of that cooling, you can time how long the ice age lasted by estimating the cooling of the ocean and the warming factors and adding them up, and you get a change in temperature, change in time. And if the temperature changed from about 86 degrees Fahrenheit and the ice age reached a maximum about, say, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a cooling of 36 degrees Fahrenheit, then I just solved for time, and that's where I got an approximate time of 500 years. It's a rough estimate, and I used maximum and minimum variables for all the heating and cooling factors for the ocean, and I bracketed the time between about 1,700 years and about 200 years. And the best estimate was about 500 years to reach glacial maximum. So it persists with time, but the ice age is rapid and it starts to end after about 500 years of buildup. Then it has to melt. First of all, you have to figure out how much ice and snow build up in that 500 years. And to do that, I had to figure where the moisture sources were. The main moisture source is the evaporation of the warm ocean, plus movement of warmer air and water vapor in that air from lower latitudes to higher latitudes. You got to figure out how much fell in the ocean versus the land. So I roughly estimated the average depth of the ice in the northern hemisphere is about 2,100 feet. In the southern hemisphere, which is mainly Antarctica, was about 4,000 feet. And then you got to figure out how long would it take to melt this. So I used the equation for the energy balance over a snow and ice cover. It's the same thing. You add up the heating factors for the ice and the cooling factors, and you add them all up and you get a change in temperature, change in time. But in this case, the temperature doesn't change. It stays at 32 degrees. So you can convert that into a melting factor. And it melts about 10 meters a year or 33 feet a year. And at that rate, the edge of the ice would melt in 70 years, and the interior of Canada, being cooler and with less solar radiation, would take more time, but that would cool in about 200 years. So the total time for the ice age was approximately 700 years based on the climatic aftermath of the Genesis flood.
Okay. Well, I think Michael Ord is pretty interesting guy, and he has a lot of information, and if you'd like to listen to him further, I'll have the links for you. But I thought these things, these particular videos were interesting, and it helps with your understanding of what occurred. I didn't want to overlook the Ice Age, because the Ice Age did have an impact on the reforming of the Earth after the flood. You've heard of glacier lakes. You've heard of meridians, where the stones that were pushed by there's all kinds of evidence of Ice Age. You find these huge monster boulders in the middle of the field, because that's where it melted and it dropped its stones. And also with the woolly mammoth and those other animals, he showed that that's where they were concentrated, in these northern parts of the world. And we're thinking, well, why were they up there? But they had these warm waters, the warm breezes, even in Great Britain. It's so far north, but it stays fairly temperate because of the warm oceans and the airs that come in. That's why Great Britain isn't as cold as what you would think it should be. But the same thing happened in these farther continents north, and they actually stayed warm in areas where you wouldn't think there'd be tree growth. In these woolly mammoths, there's an abundance of grasslands. They thrive there, and then as the Ice Age progressed, they got marooned, and then a lot of them died of starvation, and eventually they were froze to death. but there's a lot more on woolly mammoths, but I did not want to not touch that subject because that is an important aspect to make this all come together. So that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. Heavenly Father, thank you for your love, your blessing, and for all these wonderful men that have spent their years and their careers and time to ferret out these truths and to figure out something that makes sense, um, other than millions and billions of years. How could things occur within the time frame that the Bible presents? And it can, and it's very plausible. It's easy to understand. So thank you for that, and for your blessing on this group and the desire for all of us to learn and help us understand that and fill in any gaps that we need to have filled in. And thank you for a wonderful evening tonight. I ask you to bless this group of people here with sweet sleeps and a wonderful weekend coming up. And just thank you so much that we're alive in this day and time, and we can know what we know, and that we can use this to help people get born again, have life in the age to come. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Stop recording.